costume. That's a nice costume you got there.
It's not a costume, officer. I'm a senior chief petty officer in the United States Navy.
Anyone can print a fake ID off the internet.
The California sun was relentless, a white-hot hammer beating down on the asphalt of Route 78. It was the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the pavement, distorting the world into a wavy mirage. For Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thorne, the heat was a familiar, almost comforting presence, a faint echo of the blistering sun of Iraq and the dry, punishing air of Afghanistan. He stood by the side of his dark blue Ford F-150, the diesel pump humming a steady, monotonous tune as it filled the truck's massive tank. The gas station was an island of mundane reality in the middle of nowhere. A small, sun-bleached building with a faded red and yellow sign surrounded by miles of dry, rolling hills. It was quiet, the only sounds the distant drone of highway traffic and the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the pump. He was on his way to see his sister in Oak Haven, a small town that had somehow managed to stay small despite the sprawl of Southern California. It was his first real leave in over a year, a short 72-hour window carved out between a high-level debriefing at Naval Base Coronado and his next pre-deployment workup. He was still in his Navy service dress blue uniform. He hadn't planned it that way, but the debrief had run long, and he knew his sister Sarah would be waiting. The uniform was immaculate, a testament to a career built on discipline. The dark navy blue jacket adorned with gold buttons was perfectly pressed. His white shirt was crisp, his black tie knotted with military precision. On his left breast, a silent, colorful story of his life was told in rows of ribbons. At the very top, set apart from the others, was the Navy Cross, its simple blue and white design belying the extraordinary heroism it represented. Below it were the bronze star with a V for valor, the Purple Heart, and a constellation of campaign and service medals that mapped out a geography of conflict most Americans only read about. On the right, the Golden Eagle, anchor and trident of the Special Warfare insignia, the SEAL Trident, gleamed in the sun. It was the symbol he had bled for, the pin he had earned through a crucible of pain and perseverance that broke 80% of those who tried. The pump clicked off, the tank full. Marcus pulled the nozzle from his truck and secured it back in its cradle. He was tired. Not the physical exhaustion of a long mission, but a deeper, soul-level weariness that came from years of living on the edge, of seeing the best and worst of humanity in the world's most dangerous places. He was looking forward to his sister's cooking, to sitting on her porch and watching his niece and nephew play, to feeling normal for just a weekend. He was thinking about whether she'd made her famous lemon meringue pie when the sharp chirp of a siren sliced through the afternoon calm. He looked up and saw a police cruiser from the Oak Haven Police Department pulling into the gas station. It didn't pull in slowly. It swung in fast, tires crunching on the loose gravel, and stopped at an angle behind his truck, effectively blocking him in. The cruiser's light bar wasn't flashing, but the aggressive maneuver sent a familiar, unwelcome jolt through him. He'd felt it before, that sudden shift in the atmosphere, the feeling of being targeted. A white police officer, young and with a stiff, almost arrogant posture, stepped out of the car. He was maybe 35, with a short military-style haircut that didn't match the slight paunch pushing against his duty belt. His hand was resting on the grip of his sidearm, a gesture that was either unconscious habit or a deliberate act of intimidation. He walked toward Marcus, his boots heavy on the concrete. His eyes, shaded by dark sunglasses, scanned Marcus from head to toe, lingering on the uniform, the ribbons, and finally his face. "Afternoon," the officer said, his voice flat, devoid of any warmth. "Everything all right here?" Marcus kept his posture relaxed but professional, the way he was trained to do in any tense encounter, foreign or domestic. "Everything's fine, officer, just getting gas." His own voice was calm, a deep baritone that carried the quiet authority of command. The officer, whose name tag read Baxter, stopped a few feet away. He ignored Marcus's answer. "That's a nice costume you got there," he said, a small, dismissive smirk playing on his lips. "Playing dress-up today?" The words hung in the hot, dry air. Marcus felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had faced down insurgents with rocket launchers, navigated minefields under the cover of darkness, and held dying friends in his arms. But in that moment, under the bright California sun, the officer's casual, dismissive insult felt like a different kind of threat. It was an assault not on his body, but on everything he was, everything he had sacrificed for. This wasn't about a uniform. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was about the color of his skin beneath it. Marcus Thorne held Officer Baxter's gaze, his mind a whirlwind of disbelief and weary resignation. He had been trained to assess threats in a fraction of a second, to read intent in the slightest flicker of an eye or the tensing of a muscle. He saw no curiosity in Baxter's eyes, no genuine inquiry. He saw only a pre-written narrative, a conclusion that had been reached long before the cruiser had even stopped. "It's not a costume, officer," Marcus said, his voice still level, betraying none of the anger coiling in his gut. "It's my uniform. I'm a senior chief petty officer in the United States Navy." Baxter chuckled, a dry, grating sound. "Sure you are, pal, and I'm the King of England. Stolen valor is a federal offense, you know that, right? It's a serious crime to be impersonating a service member." The accusation was so outrageous, so profoundly ignorant, that Marcus had to take a slow, deliberate breath to keep his composure. 16 years of service, 6 combat deployments, a chest full of medals earned in places that haunted his dreams. And he was being accused of faking it. He decided to follow protocol, to treat this as a misunderstanding, however willful it might be on the officer's part. "Officer, I can assure you I'm not impersonating anyone," he said, moving with deliberate slowness. He reached inside his jacket, making sure his hands were in plain sight. "I'm reaching for my military identification. It's in my inside pocket." Baxter's hand tightened on his weapon. "Keep your hands where I can see them. Move slowly." Marcus complied, his movements economical and precise. He pulled out his wallet and from it, his common access card, the standard military ID. He held it out for the officer to inspect. "This is my CAC card. It has my name, rank, branch of service, and my DOD identification number. You can verify it." Baxter took the card, holding it between his thumb and forefinger as if it were contaminated. He glanced at it for no more than 2 seconds before flicking it back at Marcus. The card fluttered and fell to the hot concrete between them. "Anyone can print a fake ID off the internet for $20, Baxter said with a dismissive wave. "Doesn't prove a thing." Marcus stared at the card lying on the ground. The ID had multiple layers of security, a gold-plated smart chip, a holographic Department of Defense seal, and a barcode. It was more secure than a driver's license, more official than a passport. To dismiss it so casually wasn't just negligence, it was a conscious refusal to see the truth. He bent down, picked up his ID, and slid it back into his wallet. "Officer," Marcus tried again, his patience fraying at the edges. "Look at the uniform. These ribbons are in a specific order of precedence according to Navy regulations." He pointed to the top of the stack. "This is the Navy Cross. It's the second highest decoration for valor a member of the Naval Service can receive. You can look up the citation. You can verify every single one of these awards." Baxter squinted at the ribbons, his expression a mask of contempt. "You can buy those online, too. A whole rack of them. Makes you look real important, I bet." The dismissiveness was a wall, and Marcus realized he was talking to a man who had no interest in facts. Baxter's reality was shaped by his own biases, and every piece of evidence Marcus presented was being filtered through that distorted lens. He wasn't seeing a decorated Navy SEAL. He was seeing a black man who, in his mind, had no right to wear such a uniform, no right to claim such honors. "With all due respect, officer, you're making a serious mistake," Marcus said, his voice hardening slightly. "I am on active duty. I just came from a classified debriefing at Coronado. I am on official leave. I am asking you to do your job and verify my status. Call the naval base. Call the NCIS duty officer. They will confirm my identity in less than 5 minutes." He was offering a simple, logical solution, a way to end this absurd confrontation. A single phone call was all it would take. But Baxter seemed to take the suggestion as a personal affront, a challenge to his authority. "I don't need to call anyone," Baxter snapped, stepping closer, invading Marcus's personal space. "I know what I see, and I see a guy in a fake uniform trying to get away with stolen valor. Now, I'm going to give you one chance to come clean. Take off that jacket, admit you bought it at a surplus store, and maybe I'll let you go with a warning." The demand was so utterly demeaning, so insulting, that for a moment Marcus was speechless. To be told to strip off his uniform, the uniform he had worn while receiving his Navy Cross, the uniform he had worn to memorial services for fallen comrades, in the middle of a gas station, under the accusatory glare of this officer, was an indignity he could scarcely comprehend. The uniform was more than just clothing. It was a symbol of his oath, his sacrifices, and the brotherhood he belonged to. Removing it would be like renouncing his entire life. "I will not be removing my uniform, officer," Marcus said, his voice now cold and firm. "This is my uniform. I am authorized to wear it, and you are unlawfully detaining me." That unwavering sense of self, that refusal to be diminished, hadn't been forged in the sterile halls of an officer's academy. It had been hammered into shape on the cracked, unforgiving sidewalks of Detroit's East Side. Long before Marcus Thorne ever saw the ocean, his world was a horizon of crumbling brick buildings and chain-link fences, a place where the future was a narrow, predetermined path for most young black men. He was born into a world of limited options, where the sirens in the night were the city's lullaby, and the question wasn't if you'd find trouble, but when. He was the son of a single mother who worked 2 jobs, her hands raw and her body tired, just to keep the lights on in their small second-floor apartment. She was a woman of immense strength and quiet faith, but the city's gravity was a powerful force. Marcus saw it pull his friends down, one by one. He saw David, his best friend since kindergarten, get swept up in the quick, easy money of the corner drug trade, his bright future extinguished by a 9mm bullet over a $10 debt before his 18th birthday. He saw Terrell, a gifted artist who could sketch life onto a page with a piece of charcoal, drop out of school to support his family, his dreams fading like his own chalk drawings in the rain. The path was laid out for him. The factory, if he was lucky, the streets, if he wasn't. He felt the walls closing in, the silent expectation that he would follow the same trajectory. But something inside him rebelled. It was a stubborn, defiant spark, fanned by the stories his grandfather, a veteran of the Korean War, used to tell. His grandfather spoke of a world beyond the neighborhood, of discipline, honor, and a brotherhood forged in shared hardship. He spoke of the uniform not as a costume, but as a mantle of responsibility. The day David was buried, a cold, gray afternoon that matched the color of the Detroit sky, Marcus walked past the rows of storefronts, past the aimless groups of young men on the corners, and straight into the military recruitment office downtown. He was 20 years old, filled with a potent mixture of grief, anger, and a desperate, clawing hunger for something more. The Navy recruiter, a grizzled chief petty officer with a kind but no-nonsense demeanor, saw past the street-smart kid with a chip on his shoulder. He saw the intelligence in Marcus's eyes, the coiled-up potential. He didn't promise an easy life. He promised the opposite. He spoke of challenges that would break most men, of a standard so high that failure was the most likely outcome. He spoke of the SEALs. He showed Marcus a video. Men crawling through mud under live fire, shivering in the freezing surf, their faces etched with exhaustion, but their eyes burning with determination. It was brutal, almost inhuman. But Marcus didn't see the punishment. He saw the purpose. He saw a way to take all the grit and resilience he had learned on the streets of Detroit and forge it into a weapon, to become a part of something that demanded absolute excellence, where your background didn't matter, only your will to succeed. He enlisted, acing the ASVAB with a score that could have landed him any job in the Navy. He could have chosen a path in electronics, intelligence, aviation, safer, more comfortable careers. But he chose the one path that promised the most pain, the highest chance of failure. He chose the path to become a Navy SEAL. His mother was terrified, her heart breaking at the thought of sending her only son into harm's way. But she saw the fire in his eyes, the same stubborn determination she saw in the mirror every morning, and she knew she couldn't stop him. He left Detroit without looking back, carrying with him the memory of his fallen friends and a solemn promise to himself. He wouldn't just survive, he would excel. He would become a man that even the ghosts of his past would have to respect. He would earn the right to wear the uniform, and he would wear it with an honor that no one, not a street thug nor a biased cop, could ever take away. That promise, made in the shadow of urban decay, was the bedrock of his identity. It was the foundation that Officer Baxter was now trying and failing to crack. The journey from the streets of Detroit to the hallowed ranks of the Navy SEALs was a descent into a special kind of hell, one meticulously designed to find the breaking point of every man who dared to enter. Basic Underwater Demolition/SEAL Training, or BUD/S, was 6 months of relentless physical and mental torture. It began at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, where the Pacific Ocean was a constant, freezing adversary. Marcus discovered that physical strength, while essential, was the least important part of the equation. BUD/S was a war against the self. It was a battle against the voice in your head that screamed for you to quit, to stop the pain, to just lie down in the warm sand and give up. His class started with 180 eager, confident candidates. By the end of Hell Week, 5.5 days of non-stop, brutal physical evolution on a total of 4 hours of sleep, only 35 remained. Marcus never quit. When his muscles screamed and his body shivered uncontrollably from hypothermia during endless surf torture sessions, he thought of the cold Detroit winters and the feeling of hopelessness he had sworn to leave behind. When instructors tried to drown him during the pool competency test, tying his hands and feet and forcing him to survive underwater for minutes at a time, he found a place of calm deep within himself, a silent refusal to panic that unnerved even the seasoned trainers. He was waterboarded by the Pacific, as the saying went, and came out harder, colder, and more determined than before. He graduated, and the day they pinned the golden trident on his chest, he felt not just pride, but a sense of profound peace. He had earned it. He was a Navy SEAL. The real work, however, had just begun. The trident wasn't an award, it was a key to a door that opened into a world of constant danger. His first deployment was to Iraq, hunting high-value targets in the labyrinthine streets of Ramadi. His second took him to the treacherous, unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan's Helmand province. It was there, in 2013, during Operation Resolute Hammer, that Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thorne truly defined the meaning of the uniform he wore. His 6-man SEAL team was on a reconnaissance mission, tracking a notorious Taliban commander known for his expertise with improvised explosive devices. They were moving through a narrow, rocky valley when the world exploded. It was a perfectly executed ambush. Machine gun fire erupted from 3 positions on the high ground, a triangulated kill zone that pinned them down instantly. RPGs slammed into the rocks around them, sending shrapnel and stone fragments flying like deadly confetti. Their point man, a young petty officer named Miller on his first combat tour, went down immediately, a round shattering his femur. Seconds later, their communications specialist, Diaz, was hit in the shoulder, the impact spinning him around and knocking him unconscious. They were trapped, outgunned, with 2 men down and no viable cover. While the rest of the team laid down suppressing fire, Marcus did the unthinkable. Without a word, he broke cover and ran into the hailstorm of bullets. He low-crawled the 40 yards to Miller, ignoring the rounds kicking up dust just inches from his head. He applied a tourniquet to the young SEAL's leg, cinching it tight to stop the catastrophic bleeding, all while whispering words of encouragement. He then hoisted the 200-pound man onto his shoulders and carried him, yard by agonizing yard, back to the relative safety of a rock outcropping. He didn't stop. He handed Miller off, grabbed more ammunition, and ran back into the kill zone for Diaz. By the time he reached the unconscious comms specialist, Marcus himself had been hit. Shrapnel from an RPG had torn through his side, a searing, white-hot pain that took his breath away. He ignored it. He packed Diaz's wound, slung him over his other shoulder, and began the second grueling trip back through the heart of the ambush. He made it back, collapsing next to his teammates, his own uniform now soaked in a mixture of his blood and theirs. All 6 members of his team survived that day. Miller kept his leg. Diaz made a full recovery. For his actions, Marcus Thorne was awarded the Navy Cross. The citation spoke of extraordinary heroism and a complete disregard for his own personal safety. He also received the Purple Heart for his wounds. The ribbons on his chest weren't just decorations. They were scars, memories, and testaments to promises kept. They were a sacred trust, earned with his own blood and the courage to run toward the fire. And Officer Baxter had just called them a costume. Kyle Baxter was not born a man filled with prejudice. He was molded into one by a lifetime of quiet disappointments and festering resentments. He grew up in a suburb an hour east of Oakhaven, a place of manicured lawns and identical houses, where success was measured by the newness of your car and the greenness of your grass. His father was a mid-level insurance salesman, a man who spoke often of the big promotion that was always just around the corner but never materialized. Kyle absorbed his father's sense of aggrieved mediocrity, the quiet bitterness of a man who felt the world owed him more than it had delivered. In high school, Kyle was never the star athlete or the academic standout. He was solidly, frustratingly average. He tried out for the football team and was a permanent fixture on the bench. He ran for student council and lost. He watched as others, seemingly with less effort, achieved the recognition he craved. He began to develop a quiet contempt for those who succeeded, convincing himself they had an unfair advantage, family connections, natural talent he lacked, or some other unearned privilege. After a lackluster 2 years at a community college, he decided he wanted a life of action and authority. He wanted the respect that had always eluded him. He applied to the FBI, the DEA, and the Border Patrol. He failed the entrance exams for all 3. The rejections stung, reinforcing his deep-seated belief that the system was rigged against him. He saw himself as a protector, a warrior, but the gatekeepers of those elite institutions didn't see it. So, he settled. He applied to the Oakhaven Police Department, a small, sleepy force where the standards were lower and the competition was less fierce. He passed the academy, not at the top of his class, but he passed. The day he received his badge was the proudest moment of his life. Finally, he had a uniform that commanded respect. He had a weapon on his hip and the authority of the law behind him. The badge gave him power, and he found that he liked the feeling of it. But the insecurity never went away. It gnawed at him. He was a small-town cop dealing with traffic violations and domestic disputes, not a federal agent chasing terrorists. The resentment simmered. Over the years, that resentment began to find a specific target. He started to notice, or rather to look for, patterns. He saw successful black professionals driving luxury cars through Oakhaven and thought, drug money. He saw Hispanic families having barbecues in the public park and thought, they're taking over. His prejudice wasn't the loud, overt racism of a Klansman. It was a quieter, more insidious strain of bigotry born from envy. He saw people of color achieving the success and status he felt was his birthright as a white man, and he couldn't square it with his worldview. In his mind, their success had to be illegitimate. They must have cheated the system he felt had cheated him. His badge became a tool to correct these perceived injustices, to put people he deemed out of place back in their lane. He began to profile. He would pull over cars for suspicious driving that just happened to be driven by black men. He would question people of color in affluent neighborhoods, demanding to know what they were doing there. Each stop was a small assertion of his power, a way to momentarily feel superior. He was 36 years old, stuck in a job he viewed as second best, his ambitions thwarted, his sense of self-worth fragile. When Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thorne stood before him, tall and composed in a decorated uniform that represented a level of elite achievement Baxter could only dream of, all of that toxic resentment boiled over. Baxter didn't see a hero. He saw everything he wasn't, a successful, respected, powerful black man. The uniform wasn't just a uniform, it was a symbol of an elite warrior class he could never join. And in the warped logic of his mind, the only possible explanation was that it had to be fake. The man couldn't have earned it. It was a stolen honor, and Kyle Baxter, the self-appointed guardian of the natural order, was going to be the one to expose the fraud. Officer Baxter's encounter with Marcus Thorne was not an isolated incident. It was the predictable culmination of a long and documented pattern of behavior that the Oak Haven Police Department had systematically ignored. His personnel file, tucked away in a filing cabinet at the station, was a chronicle of racial bias disguised as proactive policing. Over his 8 years on the force, 12 official complaints had been filed against him. Every single one was from a person of color. The first came just a year after he joined the force. A black family, the Hendersons, had been holding a reunion barbecue at Oak Haven's main public park. Baxter, on patrol, approached them and began demanding to see their park permit. When Mr. Henderson explained that no permit was required for a simple family gathering, Baxter became aggressive, threatening to write citations for littering and excessive noise, despite the fact that their area was clean and their music was barely audible. The complaint described him as condescending and hostile, treating them like criminals for having a family picnic. The complaint was closed after Baxter's supervisor had a counseling session with him, which consisted of a 10-minute chat over coffee. The official report stated, "Misunderstanding resolved." 2 years later, a complaint was filed by a Hispanic landscape contractor named Miguel Ramirez. Baxter had pulled him over in an affluent, predominantly white neighborhood. The reason for the stop? The ladder on his truck wasn't properly secured. Ramirez's ladder was, in fact, secured with 3 industrial-grade straps. Baxter then detained him for over 30 minutes, questioning him about whether he had a business license and whether his workers were legal citizens, all while his crew waited, unable to work. Ramirez filed a complaint of harassment. It was deemed unfounded after Baxter wrote in his report that he was simply investigating a potential code violation. Another complaint came from Dr. Eris Thorne, a black cardiologist who had just moved to Oak Haven. He was photographing a historic building downtown for his wife, an architect, when Baxter confronted him, questioning him about what he was doing and implying he could be a terrorist conducting surveillance. Dr. Thorne, a respected physician, was forced to explain his hobby to an officer who looked at him with undisguised suspicion. The complaint went nowhere. The pattern was undeniable. A black college student pulled over for driving suspiciously through a nice neighborhood. A Latino teenager questioned for loitering while waiting for his mother outside the grocery store. In every case, Baxter's actions were predicated on a single, biased assumption. The person of color he was confronting did not belong. The department's response was a study in institutional inertia. Baxter's supervisors, men who had known him for years, saw him as overzealous but results-oriented. Notes in his annual evaluations mentioned that he could benefit from additional de-escalation training, or that he should work on his community engagement skills. These were suggestions, not mandates. 3 of the 12 complaints resulted in a formal letter of reprimand, a piece of paper that went into his file and was promptly forgotten. 4 led to mandatory online cultural sensitivity courses, which Baxter clicked through in an afternoon without absorbing a single lesson. The other 5 were closed with the catch-all phrase, "insufficient evidence to sustain the complaint," despite witness statements corroborating the victim's accounts. 0 complaints ever resulted in a suspension, a demotion, or any meaningful consequence. The system was designed to protect its own. Complaining against an officer was a difficult, intimidating process, and the department treated each incident in a vacuum, never connecting the dots to see the clear and disturbing picture that was forming. They failed to see that they weren't dealing with a series of unrelated misunderstandings, but with a single officer engaged in a consistent campaign of racial profiling. So, Kyle Baxter continued to patrol the streets of Oak Haven, his prejudices validated by his department's inaction. He was a time bomb, and the system that was supposed to disarm him had instead allowed him to keep ticking. The department had been given 12 chances to intervene, 12 opportunities to correct his behavior. They ignored them all. The confrontation with Senior Chief Marcus Thorne wasn't an accident. It was an inevitability. Baxter had just finally targeted a man whose credentials and whose brotherhood could not be dismissed, ignored, or filed away. Back at the sun-drenched gas station, the air grew thick with tension. Marcus Thorne stood his ground, a pillar of disciplined calm against Officer Baxter's rising tide of aggression. Other customers were starting to take notice. A trucker fueling his rig a few pumps over had stopped, watching the scene unfold with a frown. A young woman sitting in her car waiting for a friend had discreetly lifted her smartphone, its camera lens catching the harsh midday light. Marcus decided to try one last time, to appeal to logic, to the very evidence pinned to his chest. He knew the chances were slim, but his training demanded he exhaust every peaceful option before a situation escalated beyond control. "Officer Baxter," he said, his voice measured and clear, deliberately using the officer's name. "Let's slow this down. You see this medal?" He pointed again to the Navy Cross. "They don't give these out for buying a costume. I earned this in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. My team was ambushed. I was wounded while pulling 2 of my teammates out of the kill zone. The story is a matter of public record. You can Google it right now on your phone." He was handing Baxter a lifeline, an easy, face-saving way to de-escalate. He was providing a specific, verifiable fact that could instantly resolve the entire situation. All Baxter had to do was take out his phone. Baxter's eyes flickered to the metal, then back to Marcus's face. For a fleeting moment, a flicker of something, doubt perhaps, or uncertainty, crossed his features. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a renewed wave of stubborn denial. To accept Marcus's story as true would be to admit that his initial judgment, the very foundation of his actions, was profoundly and embarrassingly wrong. It would mean admitting that the decorated hero standing before him was a black man, and that reality simply did not compute in his prejudiced mind. "I'm not going to Google anything," Baxter scoffed, his voice laced with derision. "You probably read that story online and memorized it. That's what you people do, always got a story." The phrase, "you people," was the final confirmation. It was the moment the quiet, implicit bias became loud and explicit. The confrontation was no longer about a uniform or an ID. It was about race. The thin veneer of professional suspicion had been stripped away, revealing the ugly bigotry underneath. Marcus felt the last of his patience evaporate, replaced by a cold, hard anger. He thought of the men he served with, men of every race, color, and creed who had fought and bled alongside him. He thought of the flag on his uniform's shoulder, the flag he had sworn to defend, and the ideals it was supposed to represent. And he thought of how utterly this officer was betraying those ideals. "There is no you people, officer," Marcus said, his voice dropping low, each word laced with quiet intensity. "There is only me, a citizen of the United States and a senior chief in its Navy, and you are failing in your duty to protect and serve." The rebuke, delivered with the calm authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, seemed to enrage Baxter. His face flushed a deep red. He saw Marcus's composure not as a sign of innocence, but as an act of defiance. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. The suspect was supposed to be intimidated, to stammer, to admit guilt. He wasn't supposed to stand there and lecture him on his duty. "That's it, you're done," Baxter snarled. "I gave you a chance to come clean and you chose to be difficult. You're obstructing my investigation." "What investigation?" Marcus countered, his voice sharp. "You haven't investigated anything. You have refused to look at my ID. You have refused to verify my service. You have done nothing but make baseless accusations based on your own prejudice." Every word was true, and the truth was a weapon that Baxter couldn't defend against. So he resorted to the only tool he had left, the power of his badge and the threat of force. He reached for his radio, his thumb pressing the transmit button. The evidence was in plain sight: the uniform, the medals, the man's unwavering composure. But Officer Baxter was blind to it. He had already judged, and now he was about to sentence. "Dispatch, this is 3 Charles 15. Baxter's voice crackled over his shoulder-mounted radio, sharp and strained. "I'm at the Chevron station on Route 78. I have a 1097 with a belligerent subject, possible 18 USC 704. He was using police codes. 1097 meant arrived on scene, but the way he said it implied a situation in progress. 18 USC 704 was the federal statute for stolen valor. He was officially escalating, painting a picture of a hostile encounter for anyone listening on the other end. Marcus stood perfectly still, his hands held slightly away from his body in a non-threatening posture. "I am not being belligerent, officer," he stated, his voice loud and clear enough for the trucker at the next pump and the woman filming from her car to hear distinctly. "I am a senior chief petty officer in the United States Navy, and I am being unlawfully harassed." The public nature of the confrontation was now undeniable. The gas station was no longer just a backdrop. It was a stage, and a small audience had gathered. The trucker had finished fueling but made no move to leave, leaning against his cab with his arms crossed, his face a mask of disapproval. The young woman in the car was now joined by her friend, who had just come out of the convenience store. Both were now openly recording with their phones. An older man who had been paying for his gas inside had come out to see what the commotion was about. These were the eyes of the public, the silent witnesses to an injustice unfolding in real time. Their presence seemed to both infuriate and embolden Officer Baxter. He felt the weight of their judgment, but his pride and his deeply entrenched bias wouldn't allow him to back down. To do so now, in front of an audience, would be an unacceptable loss of face. He had to be right. He had to win. "Put your hands on the hood of the truck," Baxter commanded, his voice rising in volume. "Now!" Marcus didn't move. He wasn't going to comply with an unlawful order that would treat him like a common criminal. This was a line he would not cross. "I have committed no crime, officer. You have no legal cause to detain me, let alone arrest me. I am once again asking you to verify my credentials." He was a rock, an immovable object of reason against Baxter's irresistible force of prejudice. The stalemate hung in the hot air, vibrating with unspoken violence. The hum of the gas pumps and the distant roar of the highway seemed to fade, and the world narrowed to the few feet of concrete separating the two men. The civilian cell phone cameras were a new factor in this old story, their silent, unblinking lenses capturing every word, every gesture. They were creating a record, an indisputable digital transcript of the events that would soon be impossible to deny or distort. Why do you think some people in positions of authority are so unwilling to admit a mistake, even when confronted with clear evidence? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Baxter took another step forward, his hand now completely off his weapon and gesturing angrily. "You think these people with their phones are going to help you? You're obstructing justice. That's another charge. You're just digging a deeper hole for yourself." The irony was staggering. Baxter was the one obstructing justice by refusing to perform a simple verification. He was the one breaking the law, and he was projecting his own criminality onto his victim. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, a wail that signaled the end of any hope for a peaceful resolution. Baxter had called for backup, and in doing so, he had ensured this confrontation would spiral out of his control. He had taken a simple, baseless suspicion and was about to transform it into a full-blown incident, one that would have consequences he couldn't possibly imagine. The backup wasn't coming to help him keep the peace. They were coming to help him make the biggest mistake of his career. Two more Oak Haven PD cruisers screeched into the gas station, lights flashing, scattering the afternoon light. They parked alongside Baxter's car, and two officers emerged. The first was Officer Chen, a 10-year veteran with a calm, observant demeanor. The second was Officer Riley, a rookie barely a year out of the academy, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. Chen assessed the situation quickly. Baxter, red-faced and agitated, a black man in a full Navy dress uniform, standing ramrod straight, composed but defiant, and a handful of civilians with their phones out, all aimed in their direction. This wasn't a typical stolen valor call. This felt different. This felt wrong. "Baxter, what's the situation?" Chen asked, his voice calm, a stark contrast to his colleague's heated state. "Stolen valor," Baxter spat, not taking his eyes off Marcus. "Subject is impersonating a senior chief, refusing to identify himself, refusing all lawful orders. He's belligerent." Chen looked at Marcus, at the perfectly aligned ribbons, at the authentic-looking trident, at the man's military bearing. Doubt immediately crept into his mind. He'd seen stolen valor cases before. They were usually overweight men in ill-fitting camouflage, their medals out of order, their stories full of holes. This man was not that. "Sir, can I see your identification?" Chen asked Marcus directly, his tone respectful. Before Marcus could answer, Baxter interjected. "He already showed me a fake ID. It's a joke. I'm arresting him." Chen put a hand up, motioning for Baxter to hold on. He ignored his agitated colleague and focused on Marcus. "Sir, what's your name and service number?" "Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thorne," Marcus replied, his voice steady and professional. "United States Navy. I showed Officer Baxter my military common access card and asked him repeatedly to verify my status through official channels. He refused." Chen's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at Baxter. "Did you run his ID? Did you make any calls?" "I don't need to," Baxter insisted, his voice cracking with frustration. "It's obviously fake. Just look at him." It was the same phrase he'd used before, the one that said everything. Just look at him. Chen understood immediately what was happening. This wasn't about the uniform, this was about Baxter. He glanced at the rookie, Riley, who looked confused and uncertain, caught between a furious senior officer and a situation that didn't add up. Chen made a decision. He pulled out his own department-issued smartphone. "What's your commanding officer's name, Senior Chief?" "Captain Rostova, Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. I'm with SEAL Team 5, Marcus answered without hesitation. Chen began to type the information into his search bar, but Baxter had reached his breaking point. He saw Chen's actions as a betrayal, a vote of no confidence in front of the public and a rookie. All his insecurities, his resentments, his rage coalesced into one rash, irreversible action. "I'm done with this!" Baxter yelled, lunging forward. "You're under arrest! Turn around! Hands behind your back!" He grabbed Marcus's arm. The move was so sudden, so aggressive, it could have triggered a violent response from any man, let alone one trained in advanced combat. But Marcus Thorne did not react with violence. He made a split-second calculation. He could resist, and this would become a physical altercation that he would likely win, but which would only complicate his situation. Or he could submit, allow the injustice to run its course, and trust that the system, the larger system of the military and the law, would ultimately hold this man accountable. He chose the latter. He slowly turned, allowing his training to guide his actions. "I am complying under protest," he said, his voice ringing with formal dignity. "I am Senior Chief Marcus Thorne of the United States Navy. This arrest is unlawful. I have committed no crime." Baxter roughly pushed him against the side of the truck, the metal cool against his cheek. He wrenched Marcus's arms behind his back and pulled out his handcuffs. The cold steel snapped shut over Marcus's wrists, the metal biting into his skin. The cuffs crushed the crisp fabric of his uniform, pressing the hard edges of his medals into his chest. Chen stood frozen for a second, his phone still in his hand, a search result for Captain Rostova, SEAL Team 5, just beginning to load. He knew in his gut that Baxter had just crossed a line from which there was no return. Riley, the rookie, just stared, his face a mixture of shock and horror. The trucker let out a low whistle. The women with the phones gasped. The cameras kept rolling, capturing the image of a decorated American war hero, his chest laden with medals for valor, being handcuffed and arrested for the crime of wearing his own uniform. The back of a police cruiser is a uniquely dehumanizing space. It's a cage of hard plastic and reinforced glass, smelling faintly of disinfectant and despair. For Marcus Thorne, sitting with his hands cuffed tightly behind his back, the 11-minute drive to the Oak Haven police station was an eternity of silent fury and profound disbelief. The metal of the handcuffs dug into his wrists with every bump and turn, a constant, painful reminder of his powerlessness. Officer Baxter drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He didn't speak, didn't turn on the radio. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the crackle of the police scanner, dispatching other officers to other, more legitimate calls. Through the partition, Marcus could see the back of Baxter's head, rigid and unmoving. He wondered what the officer was thinking. Was he proud? Did he feel like he had done good police work? Or was there a sliver of doubt, a tiny voice of reason trying to break through the wall of his prejudice? Marcus suspected it was the former. Men like Baxter didn't doubt themselves. Their bigotry was a fortress. Marcus stared out the side window, watching the familiar landscape of Southern California roll by. Sun-bleached strip malls, rows of suburban houses, palm trees swaying against a painfully blue sky. It was the same scenery he'd see on his way to visit his sister, but now it looked alien, hostile. He was a stranger in his own land, a prisoner in the country he had sworn to defend. The irony was a bitter pill. He thought of the times he had been detained overseas, frisked at checkpoints in Baghdad and Kandahar by foreign soldiers. Those moments were tense, but they were logical. He was an armed American soldier in a foreign land. Suspicion was part of the landscape. But this was different. This was his home. The uniform he wore was supposed to be a symbol of honor and trust, a bridge to the American people. Here, today, it had been twisted into a target. His mind drifted back to the faces of the men he had served with. Miller, whose leg he had saved. Diaz, whom he had carried out of a kill zone. Men of all backgrounds united by a common purpose who had trusted him with their lives. What would they think if they could see him now, handcuffed, humiliated, accused of being a fraud by a man who had likely never faced a danger greater than a speeding ticket? The thought filled him with a quiet, burning shame, even though he knew he had done nothing wrong. The shame was not for himself, but for the situation, for the insult it represented to the entire brotherhood of arms. He focused on his breathing, a technique he'd mastered during SEER, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape training. Slow, deep breaths to control his heart rate, to keep his mind clear, to prevent the rage from overwhelming him. Anger was a luxury he couldn't afford. He needed to be calm, to be observant, to be the professional he had always been. He mentally cataloged every detail of the encounter, the time, the location, Baxter's exact words, the presence of witnesses, the other officers' reactions. He was no longer just a victim, he was a witness to a crime, and he would be prepared to give his testimony. They arrived at the Oak Haven station at 3:42 p.m. It was a low, modern building of concrete and glass that looked more like a community college than a police precinct. Baxter pulled into the sally port, the secure garage where prisoners were brought in, the heavy steel door closing behind them with a loud, definitive clang, shutting out the outside world. He got out, opened the back door, and roughly pulled Marcus from the car. As he was marched through a metal door into the booking area, Marcus took one last deep breath. The battle at the gas station was over. The battle for justice was just beginning. The booking area of the Oak Haven Police Department was a sterile, brightly lit room that smelled of stale coffee and cleaning supplies. Behind a high counter sat Sergeant Frank Miller, a man in his late 50s with a graying mustache, and the weary eyes of a cop who had seen it all. Miller was a 25-year veteran of the force, a man who had worked his way up from patrolman and had earned the respect of his colleagues through quiet competence rather than loud bravado. He was 2 years from retirement, and very little surprised him anymore. Until today. He looked up from his computer screen as Officer Baxter pushed a handcuffed man in a Navy service dress blue uniform toward the counter. Miller froze. His gaze swept over the man, taking in the senior chief insignia on the collar, the immaculate, if now wrinkled, uniform, and the impressive stack of ribbons on his chest. Miller had served 4 years in the Marine Corps before becoming a cop, and he knew a military uniform when he saw one. He knew the order of precedence for ribbons, and he knew with absolute certainty that the blue and white ribbon at the very top of the stack was the Navy Cross. His eyes lifted from the uniform to the man wearing it. He saw no fear, no panic, no guilt. He saw only a man radiating a powerful aura of controlled fury and profound dignity. "Baxter, what in the hell is this?" Miller asked, his voice a low rumble. He stood up slowly, his imposing frame filling the space behind the desk. "Booking him for stolen valor, Sarge," Baxter said, trying to sound confident but failing to hide a nervous edge. "Caught him at the Chevron on 78 impersonating a senior chief. He was belligerent, refused my orders." Miller ignored Baxter and walked around the desk. He stopped directly in front of Marcus, his eyes carefully examining the uniform up close. The trident was expertly crafted, not a cheap knockoff. The ribbons were perfectly aligned, not a single one out of place. The uniform itself was tailored, made of high-quality fabric. It screamed authenticity. "What's your name, Senior Chief?" Miller asked, his tone respectful, pointedly using the rank Baxter had dismissed. "Marcus Thorne, United States Navy," Marcus replied, his voice calm. "I attempted to show Officer Baxter my military ID. I requested he verify my identity. He refused and placed me under arrest." Miller's gaze shifted to Baxter, and his eyes were like chips of ice. "You arrested a man wearing the Navy Cross without verifying his ID?" "It's a fake ID, Sarge. The whole thing is a sham," Baxter insisted, his voice rising. "Let me see it," Miller commanded. Baxter hesitated, then sullenly retrieved Marcus's wallet from an evidence bag and slapped it on the counter. Miller picked it up, opened it, and carefully removed the common access card. He held it under the bright fluorescent light, turning it over and over. He saw the hologram, the embedded chip, the crispness of the printing. He'd seen plenty of fake IDs in his day. They were usually flimsy, blurry, and obviously counterfeit. This was not one of them. "This looks real to me, Kyle," Miller said, his voice dangerously quiet. "It has an embedded security chip. You can't fake that." "He's a con artist!" Miller had heard enough. He turned his back on Baxter, a clear sign of dismissal, and walked back to his desk. He picked up the phone. "What's your duty station, Senior Chief?" "Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. I'm attached to SEAL Team 5, Marcus said. Miller dialed the number for the base's quarterdeck, the 24-hour command post. He knew that one phone call would either prove Baxter right or confirm that the young officer had just made a career-ending mistake. The phone rang twice before a young professional voice answered. "Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, Petty Officer on watch." "This is Sergeant Miller with the Oak Haven Police Department in California," Miller said. "I'm calling to verify the status of a service member. I have a Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thorne, who states he is assigned to SEAL Team 5. There was a pause, and Miller could hear the faint sound of typing in the background. The booking area was silent, the only sound the hum of the overhead lights. Baxter stood shifting his weight, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. After about 60 seconds that felt like an hour, the petty officer came back on the line. His voice had changed. It was more formal, more alert. "Sergeant, I can confirm that Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thorne is an active-duty Navy SEAL assigned to Naval Special Warfare Group 1, attached to SEAL Team 5. Sir, can you please tell me the nature of your inquiry?" Sergeant Miller's face went pale. He looked at Baxter, then at the decorated warrior standing in handcuffs, then back at Baxter. He lowered the phone slightly from his ear and spoke, his voice barely a whisper, but every word landing on Baxter like a hammer blow. "He's real, Kyle. You arrested a goddamn Navy SEAL." On the other end of the line at Coronado, the petty officer on watch felt a surge of adrenaline. The words arrested and Navy SEAL in the same sentence set off an immediate cascade of protocols. This wasn't a routine verification anymore. It was a critical incident. "Sergeant, please hold the line," the petty officer said, his voice now a model of military efficiency. He simultaneously hit a button on his console that alerted the officer of the deck, OOD, and typed a frantic message into the internal command chat system. "Urgent! Oak Haven PD has SCPO Marcus Thorne, ST5, under arrest. Need immediate command notification." The OOD, a young lieutenant, was at his desk in seconds. He took the call from Sergeant Miller, quickly gathering the basic facts. The location, the arresting officer's name, the charge of stolen valor. The sheer absurdity of the charge, leveled against a senior enlisted SEAL known throughout the command, was staggering. Within 2 minutes, at 4:03 p.m., the OOD was on a secure line to the Command Duty Officer, CDO, for Naval Special Warfare Group 1. The CDO, a seasoned commander, was at home, but his duty phone never left his side. As he listened to the OOD's report, he pulled up Thorne's service record on his encrypted laptop. The screen glowed with a litany of heroism. 6 combat deployments, Navy Cross, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, spotless conduct record, active top-secret/SCI security clearance. The idea that this man was impersonating himself was beyond ludicrous. At 4:09 p.m., the CDO made the next call, the one that escalated the situation from a serious problem to a full-blown crisis. He called his boss, Captain Anya Rostova, the commanding officer of SEAL Team 5, at her home. Rostova was a formidable leader, a veteran of the intelligence community before taking command, known for her sharp intellect and fierce devotion to her men. "Ma'am, we have a situation," the CDO began. "Oak Haven PD has Senior Chief Thorne in custody. They arrested him at a gas station for stolen valor." There was a moment of dead silence on the line. Captain Rostova processed the information, her mind instantly calculating the ramifications. One of her best men, a decorated combat veteran, had been arrested for wearing his uniform. The insult was profound, but the potential security breach was even worse. Thorne was privy to some of the nation's most sensitive classified information. "Get me the NCIS duty agent in San Diego, now," Rostova commanded, her voice like ice. "And get a JAG officer on the line. I want them both ready to move in 5 minutes. What's the name of the police department and the arresting officer?" The information was relayed. As soon as she hung up, the wheels of the U.S. military's legal and investigative branches began to turn with terrifying speed. At 4:15 p.m., a senior special agent from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS, was on the phone with Rostova. He had already pulled Thorne's file. "Captain, I'm looking at his record. This is insane," the agent said. "Damn right it's insane," Rostova shot back. "This isn't just a wrongful arrest. This is a potential violation of federal law under 18 U.S.C. 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. I want a federal investigation opened immediately." Simultaneously, the situation was rocketing up the operational chain of command. Naval Special Warfare Command Headquarters was notified. From there, it went straight to the Pentagon. By 4:30 p.m., less than an hour after Marcus had been placed in handcuffs, a 2-star admiral in the Navy Operations Center was being briefed. A Navy SEAL with a Navy Cross had been arrested by local police in California. The news spread through the secure communication networks of the Pentagon like a shockwave. This was no longer a local police matter. The jurisdiction had shifted. The full weight of the United States Navy was now bearing down on a small police department in Oak Haven, California. Back in the booking area, Sergeant Miller was still on the phone, trying to explain the situation to a now very concerned lieutenant at Coronado. Officer Baxter stood frozen, the color drained from his face as he began to comprehend the catastrophic scale of his good arrest. He had not just arrested a man, he had arrested an institution, and that institution was now stirring like a leviathan awakened from the deep. Captain Anya Rostova was not a woman given to emotional outbursts. Her career had been built on cold, calculated analysis and unwavering command presence. But as she paced the floor of her study, a secure phone pressed to her ear, a cold, controlled fury radiated from her. The arrest of one of her men, of Marcus Thorne, a SEAL she respected immensely, was not just a bureaucratic problem. It was a personal affront and an institutional disgrace. "Agent Kellerman," she said to the NCIS agent on the line, "I want you to understand something. Senior Chief Thorne is not just any sailor. He holds one of the highest security clearances this nation grants. He has knowledge of operations that, if compromised, could put American lives at risk. The fact that he is currently in the custody of an unvetted, hostile local police officer is an unacceptable security risk." She was framing the issue in terms the entire federal government would understand: national security. This was no longer just about a biased cop, it was about protecting state secrets. "Understood, Captain," the NCIS agent replied. "We're treating it as such. I'm en route to the station now with my partner. We'll assert federal interest." Next, Rostova conferenced in a senior lawyer from the Navy's Judge Advocate General's Corps. "Commander, are you patched in?" "Yes, Captain," came the reply. "I want Senior Chief Thorne released, and I want him released an hour ago," Rostova said, her voice sharp. "I don't care what you have to do. Call the DA, call the city attorney, call the damn mayor. You explain to them that the Oak Haven Police Department is currently holding a decorated active-duty special operator without legal cause, in direct violation of his civil rights. You remind them of the potential for a multi-million-dollar federal lawsuit that their city will absolutely lose. Are we clear?" "Crystal clear, ma'am," the JAG officer responded, already pulling up the relevant statutes. But Rostova wasn't finished. She knew that bureaucratic channels, even expedited ones, could be slow. She needed to apply maximum pressure from the top down. She looked at the clock. It was 4:55 p.m. She made her most important call yet, not to an admiral, but directly to the office of the Oak Haven Chief of Police, Robert Gideon. It was after hours, so she was routed to his administrative assistant. "This is Captain Anya Rostova, commanding officer of SEAL Team 5 at Coronado. I need to speak with Chief Gideon immediately. It is a matter of national security." The phrase national security worked like a magic key. 5 minutes later, a bewildered Chief Gideon was on the line from his car, having been patched through on his way home. "Chief Gideon, this is Captain Rostova," she began, her voice devoid of any pleasantries. "Are you aware that one of your officers, a Kyle Baxter, has arrested one of my senior chiefs at a gas station for impersonating a naval officer?" There was a stunned silence from Gideon's end. I'm not aware of that, Captain. There must be some mistake." "The mistake, Chief, was made by your officer," Rostova retorted. "Senior Chief Marcus Thorne is a national hero. He holds the Navy Cross for gallantry in action. He has served this country with distinction for 16 years. And your officer, based on what I can only assume is gross incompetence or blatant racial prejudice, has seen fit to handcuff him and throw him in your station." Gideon stammered, "I'm sure we can sort this out." Rostova cut him off. "There is nothing to sort out. You have unlawfully detained a member of the United States Armed Forces. As we speak, I have NCIS agents and Navy lawyers en route to your station. I am one phone call away from having the Secretary of the Navy's office call the Governor of California. So I'm going to tell you exactly what is going to happen. You are going to drive to your station immediately. You are going to personally uncuff my senior chief. You are going to offer him your deepest, most profound apology. And then you are going to hand Officer Baxter's badge and service weapon over to my NCIS agents. Is there any part of that instruction that was unclear?" The threat, both explicit and implicit, was overwhelming. Gideon, a small-town police chief, was suddenly facing the full, terrifying power of the U.S. military. His mind reeled. A federal investigation, lawsuits, the Pentagon, the governor. His career was flashing before his eyes. "No, Captain," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Nothing was unclear. "Good," Rostova said and hung up. She stood in the silence of her study, her knuckles white as she gripped her phone. She had unleashed the storm. Now it was time for it to make landfall in Oakhaven. Chief Robert Gideon's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, his peaceful drive home transformed into a frantic race back to the station. Captain Rostova's voice, cold and sharp as shattered glass, echoed in his mind. "National Security, Federal Investigation, Secretary of the Navy." These were phrases that had never before entered the lexicon of his sleepy suburban police department. He fumbled for his radio, his voice strained as he called his own dispatch. "Dispatch, this is Gideon. Get me the watch commander at the station, now." The watch commander, a lieutenant named Harris, came on the line a moment later. "Chief, everything okay?" "No, Harris, everything is not okay," Gideon yelled, swerving to avoid a slow-moving car. "Who did Officer Baxter bring in within the last hour?" Stand by, Chief." Harris sounded confused by the urgency. "Looks like one arrest. A male, black, for stolen valor. He's in booking with Sergeant Miller now." "Was he wearing a Navy uniform?" Gideon demanded, his heart pounding. "Yes, sir. A dress blue uniform. Says he's a..." Harris paused as he read the screen. "A Navy SEAL." Gideon's blood ran cold. It was true. The nightmare was real. "Listen to me very carefully, Harris. Do not let that man be put in a holding cell. Do not process his paperwork. Take his handcuffs off immediately. I am on my way. And you tell Sergeant Miller that NCIS and Navy JAG are en route to our station. This is a federal matter now." He hung up, leaving a stunned watch commander on the other end. Back at the station, Harris relayed the chief's frantic orders to Sergeant Miller in the booking area. Miller, who had already been stalling the booking process, looked over at Baxter, who was now pacing nervously. "Chief's on his way. He wants the cuffs off." "Now," Miller said, nodding toward Marcus. Baxter hesitated, his authority completely shattered. With trembling hands, he took the key and unlocked the handcuffs from Marcus's wrists. The metal fell away, leaving angry red welts. Marcus brought his hands around to his front, slowly rubbing his wrists, his face an unreadable mask of dignity. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The entire power dynamic in the room had shifted. Baxter was no longer the accuser. He was now the accused, a fact that was dawning on him with sickening clarity. 15 minutes later, Chief Gideon burst into the booking area. He was in civilian clothes, his face pale and beaded with sweat. He ignored his own officers and walked directly to Marcus. "Senior Chief Thorne," he began, his voice shaky. "I am Police Chief Robert Gideon. On behalf of the Oakhaven Police Department, I cannot possibly apologize enough for what has happened here. This is an unforgivable mistake. You are free to go. All charges have been dropped, of course." Marcus met the chief's panicked gaze with a look of cold steel. "An apology doesn't fix this, Chief," he said, his voice quiet but carrying more weight than Gideon's frantic outburst. "Your officer didn't make a mistake. He made a choice. He chose to see a black man as a criminal instead of a serviceman. He refused to verify my credentials. He chose to humiliate me, to arrest me in front of civilians for a crime I did not commit. That's not a mistake. That's a failure of character and a violation of your department's oath." Gideon flinched as if he'd been struck. "I understand, sir. We will be conducting a full and thorough internal investigation, I promise you." "The Pentagon is already conducting their investigation, Chief," Marcus corrected him. "This is out of your hands." As if on cue, the doors to the booking area swung open. 2 figures entered, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop by 20 degrees. They were a man and a woman, dressed in sharp, professional civilian attire, but they moved with an unmistakable air of federal authority. "Chief Gideon," the man said, flashing a badge. "Special Agent Kellerman, NCIS. This is my partner, Special Agent Cho. This precinct is now part of a federal investigation into civil rights violations. We're here for Senior Chief Thorne, and we're also here for him." He pointed a thumb directly at Kyle Baxter. "Officer Baxter, you are to surrender your firearm and your badge. You will come with us. We have some questions for you." The unraveling was complete. The authority of the Oak Haven Police Department had evaporated in its own station. Baxter looked around wildly, his eyes pleading, but no one would meet his gaze. Sergeant Miller looked away in disgust. Chief Gideon just stared at the floor, a broken man watching his department and his career crumble before his very eyes. The moment NCIS walked into the Oak Haven police station, the story ceased to be a local incident. It became a federal case, and within 24 hours, a national scandal. The cell phone videos, shot by the witnesses at the gas station, hit the internet like a wildfire. The footage was damning. It showed a calm, decorated naval officer being harassed, dismissed, and ultimately arrested by a hostile, aggressive cop. News outlets, both local and national, picked it up immediately. The image of Senior Chief Marcus Thorne, his chest covered in medals for valor, being forced into the back of a police car, was played on a loop on every major network. The Pentagon, which normally moved with deliberate bureaucratic slowness, acted with lightning speed. The Secretary of the Navy issued a blistering public statement condemning the despicable and baseless arrest of a decorated American hero. He announced a full Department of the Navy review of interactions between service members and civilian law enforcement nationwide. The story was no longer just about one bad cop, it was about a larger systemic issue. For Kyle Baxter, the world fell apart. He was immediately suspended without pay, but that was the least of his worries. The NCIS interrogation was brutal and efficient. They already had copies of the cell phone videos, the gas station's security footage, and Baxter's complete personnel file from the Oak Haven PD, which Captain Rostova's JAG officers had procured with a federal subpoena. The pattern of 12 prior complaints, all against people of color, formed the backbone of their case. The U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of California, a formidable prosecutor named Elena Ramirez, took personal charge of the case. She saw it not just as a crime against one man, but as an attack on the principles of justice and the honor of the armed forces. A federal grand jury was convened, and the indictment came down swiftly. Kyle Baxter was charged with 2 federal crimes: a felony violation of 18 U.S.C. paragraph 242, deprivation of rights under color of law, for unlawfully arresting Thorne without probable cause based on his race, and a felony violation of Osum Neist U.S.C. Section 111, assaulting, resisting, or impeding certain officers or employees, which, in a bitter twist of irony, applies to federal employees, including members of the armed forces like Senior Chief Thorne. The evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution had multiple high-definition videos of the entire encounter. They had the testimony of the civilian witnesses. They had the expert testimony of military personnel who confirmed the authenticity of Thorne's uniform and credentials from a single glance. They had Officer Chen, who testified that Baxter had refused to verify Thorne's identity and had uttered the damning words, "Just look at him." Most powerfully, they had the testimony of Senior Chief Marcus Thorne himself. He took the stand in his full service dress blue uniform. He spoke calmly, professionally, and with unshakable dignity. He recounted the events without embellishment or emotion, his words carrying the simple, undeniable weight of truth. He explained what each medal on his chest meant, not with pride, but as a matter of fact. When he described what it felt like to be accused of faking his service, the courtroom was utterly silent. Baxter's defense was weak, pathetic. His attorney tried to argue that his client had made a reasonable mistake in a high-stress situation, that he was only trying to uphold the law against stolen valor. But the prosecution dismantled that argument piece by piece. How could it be reasonable to ignore a military ID with multiple security features? How could it be reasonable to dismiss a Navy cross as fake? How could it be reasonable to refuse a simple 2-minute phone call that would have resolved the entire situation? The trial lasted 6 days. The jury, a diverse group of men and women, deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they filed back into the courtroom, their verdict was clear. Guilty, on all counts. Kyle Baxter stood motionless as the verdict was read, his face ashen. He had built his world on a foundation of prejudice and resentment, and now that world had collapsed, burying him in its ruins. He had targeted a man he saw as beneath him, only to find that man was protected by a system far more powerful and just than his own petty hatred. The wheels of justice, though sometimes slow, were now grinding inexorably toward his day of reckoning. The sentencing hearing took place a month later. The courtroom was packed. On one side sat Marcus Thorne, flanked by Captain Rostova and a contingent of his fellow SEALs, all in their dress uniforms, a silent, powerful show of solidarity. On the other side sat Kyle Baxter's family, their faces etched with grief and disbelief. Baxter himself, now in a drab prison jumpsuit, seemed to have aged 10 years. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed fear. The judge, a stern woman named Rebecca Howell, had a reputation for being tough but fair. She listened as the prosecutor argued for the maximum possible sentence, detailing the profound damage Baxter's actions had caused, not just to Marcus Thorne, but to the community's trust in law enforcement and the nation's respect for its service members. Baxter's attorney pleaded for leniency, painting a picture of a man who had made a terrible mistake, a man who had been overwhelmed by stress. Baxter himself was given a chance to speak. He stood and, in a halting, choked voice, offered an apology to Marcus. "I was wrong," he mumbled, his eyes on the floor. "I'm sorry." But his apology rang hollow. It was the apology of a man caught, not of a man who truly understood the depth of his prejudice. Then the judge turned to Marcus and asked if he wished to make a statement. Marcus stood. He did not look at Baxter. He looked at the judge. "Your Honor," he began, his voice clear and steady. "This man's actions were an insult to me, but they were more than that. They were an insult to every man and woman who has ever worn the uniform of this country, especially those who look like me. We swear an oath to protect this nation from all enemies, foreign and domestic. We never expect the domestic threat to be wearing a police uniform in our own hometown." He paused, letting the words sink in. "The real tragedy is that I was lucky. I had the backing of the United States Navy. I had a captain who would go to war for me. I had NCIS and JAG. Most people who look like me and have this happen to them don't have that. Their stories are buried in a file, dismissed as unfounded. Their justice is denied. A sentence for Mr. Baxter isn't just about punishing him. It's about sending a message that this cannot and will not be tolerated. The uniform should be a symbol of unity, not a reason for suspicion." He sat down. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Judge Howell looked down at Kyle Baxter, her expression grim. "Mr. Baxter," she said, her voice ringing with authority, "you did not make a mistake. You abused your power. You betrayed your oath. You allowed your personal prejudice to overwhelm your professional duty. You targeted a man not for what he had done, but for who he was. In doing so, you dishonored your badge, your department, and the very laws you swore to uphold." She picked up her gavel. "On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, and for the assault on a federal officer, this court sentences you to a term of 60 years in federal prison." A gasp went through the courtroom. 60 years. It was essentially a life sentence. Baxter collapsed into his chair as if his strings had been cut. Justice had been served, not with a whisper, but with a thunderclap. The storm had passed. For Marcus Thorne, the verdict was not a moment of celebration, but one of sober reflection. He knew this single victory didn't win the war, The real fight was quieter, fought not in courtrooms, but in the hearts and minds of people like Kyle Baxter. What creates a man like that? It's a slow poison of insecurity, envy, and a feeling of being left behind, which then curdles into a desperate need for power over others. Baxter saw in Marcus a reflection of everything he failed to be, and his prejudice provided an easy excuse to tear that reflection down. Could this have been avoided? Perhaps. If Marcus had reacted with anger at the gas station, the narrative might have twisted. The videos might have shown a hostile suspect instead of a composed professional, giving Baxter the justification he craved. If Sergeant Miller, a man with his own military background, hadn't been on duty that day, Marcus could have been processed and lost in the system for hours or even days. His survival in this urban battlefield depended not just on his own discipline, but on the fortunate presence of a few good people who chose to see the truth. The lesson for him was a painful one. The most dangerous enemy is the one who sees your honor as a threat. The truest justice isn't found in a prison sentence, but in creating a world where such a sentence is never necessary. It's in building a society where a man's character is judged by the content of his heart and the honor of his actions, not by the color of his skin under a decorated uniform. We share these stories to shine a light on both the valor of those who serve and the injustices they sometimes face back home. What part of Marcus Thorne's story resonated with you the most? Do you believe the 60-year sentence was a just outcome? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please consider subscribing to help us continue our mission.